So the first definition we're going to start with is culture. So culture is learned dynamic behavior, the values, traditions, symbols, beliefs, and practices which are created and shared by a group of people bound together by such common factors as history, location, or social class. Another way to think about culture is to see it as customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group, or a set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterize an institution or an organization. I think it's important to talk about the word, to start at the word culture, because I think sometimes in the world, in library land and other places, the word culture can be used as code for talking about race and or ethnicity, when actually culture is much broader. As librarians, we are exposed to all kinds of cultures every day. There's gamer culture, there's maker culture, there is Latino culture, there's LGBTQ culture, and so on and so on. But really, culture is a very sort of broad concept, and I think it's important not to always conflate it specifically with race and ethnicity. However, for the purposes of this webinar, I am actually going to talk about cultural competency, specifically as it relates to race and privilege, mostly because those are some of the issues we've been dealing with here at Skokie Public Library, and some of the initial feedback that I got about what people were looking for in this webinar seemed to indicate that that was an interest area. So just throwing that out there. So one helpful way to kind of think about culture is this concept called the iceberg culture model. So in thinking about how we as professionals engage culture, it's helpful to again look at this picture of the iceberg. When we see an iceberg, often all that is visible is what is above water. But really what we can see is only a small piece of a much larger whole. And culture kind of operates the same way. Oftentimes we observe shared characteristics such as food or dance, music, art, greetings, all of these things, and we think this is what culture is. When really what we associate with culture are actually only manifestations of some of the deeper and broader components of culture. And I think it's helpful to kind of keep this image in mind as well, because I think this is often how cultural stereotypes start to manifest themselves and can manifest themselves problematically. And I think this is also sort of the starting point for where we start to see cultural insensitivity and or start to see where unequal services start to develop. Okay. Moving on to some more terms, I also wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the difference between cultural competency and cultural awareness. So cultural competency is defined as a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, structures, and policies that come together to work effectively in intercultural situations. Whereas cultural awareness is the ability to recognize the different beliefs, values, and customs that someone has based on that person's origins. So cultural awareness can allow a person to build a more successful personal and professional relationships in a diverse environment. I think it's important to highlight sort of what that critical difference between awareness and competency is. Cultural competence means accepting and respecting cultural differences. When we're putting this in the context of talking about race and privilege, it can mean the idea of refuting coming from a place of colorblindness, for example. Cultural competence also means paying attention to the dynamics of cultural difference, expanding our cultural knowledge, and working to adopt culturally relevant service models and finding opportunities to promote the leadership of minority populations. I think when I think about this, I think for librarians, cultural awareness is totally our wheelhouse. We really pride ourselves on recognizing diverse audiences, on recognizing underserved communities, and trying to respond as best as we can with programs and services. And I think one of the core principles of cultural competency is not just in our assessment and knowledge of the cultures around us, but also in a self-reflective piece of our own cultural history, our own cultural values and beliefs, and the ways this informs how we do or don't create safe spaces or relevant service models for the communities that we serve. So again, I wanted to kind of be able to highlight what the relationship is between cultural awareness and how that informs cultural competency. And I think that that's a nice segue for talking about the idea of privilege. So there are many forms of privilege that exist in this world. There's class privilege, there is gender privilege, there's able-bodied privilege, there's heterosexual privilege. There's so many sort of privileges that we can sort of put out there. I did specifically put out a definition, not only just in general of privilege, but of white privilege, again, because of the context I wanted this webinar to focus on, and also because I do know that right now in our field, we do have an overrepresentation of white professionals and white librarians, and I think it's important to acknowledge how this privilege is informing the spaces that we create. And I know I do recognize that not all of us here today are white, but I think it's still an important concept for us all to be mindful of. Um, so privilege is a right or immunity granted or a personal benefit, advantage, or favor. Privilege grants a set of benefits and system rewards to one group while simultaneously excluding other groups from accessing these privileges. And white privilege, of course, extends this to white people who enjoy privileges, immunity, common advantages that aren't given to others. And the reason why I talk about this too is that I think in our current context, I think we make a lot of assumptions about being a safe institution for all of our community members because public libraries, are such a big part of the safety net for their community. And I think that while we often have the best of intentions to be safe, cultural competency in our institutions requires more than sort of just good intentions. I read a quote in doing research for this webinar that the journey towards cultural competence requires the willingness to learn from one's experience and act. And one of the things that I've noticed in library discourse when we're talking about white privilege is that we often focus on the need to diversify our workforce, which I think is a really, really important piece in building a culturally competent institution. And I think that we should continue to strive towards doing that. But I would also like to see us address white privilege because hiring people of color isn't going to be, I think, isn't the ultimate answer to all of our problems. I'd like to see us asking questions about the ways that white privilege operates in our libraries. What are interpersonal interactions that happen in our libraries that sustain white privilege? What are the structural ways we sustain white privilege? I'm wondering about ways we can learn from the current national conversation happening around police accountability. I'm sure most police departments assume or want to assume that communities see them as agents of safety, but they actually haven't been seen that way or haven't actually been that for particularly the African American community. So what are the ways we assume we are a safe institution for minority communities? And what practices and policies do we employ that reinforce this? Do our collections represent the communities we serve? Do our disciplinary policies unfairly target some of the populations that we serve? I'd like to see us start kind of asking more of these questions in the library world. So moving on to some other terms and concepts, I also wanted to touch upon the idea of being an ally and being an anti-racism. These are terms that were definitely popular from my heyday in the social justice world, and I think they're particularly important when talking about YA services. As library folks who want to develop culturally responsive programs and services, I think we need to actually identify ourselves as allies to underserved audiences. And the definition of being an ally is a member of the quote unquote majority group who rejects the dominant ideology and takes action against oppression, or of a belief that eliminating oppression will benefit the target group and the minority group. So I think another complicated area of librarianship that I sort of struggle with is I think that we really try to champion and advocate for underserved communities, and this is a really beautiful thing. I think that libraries are doing incredible and transformative work across the country. I also think that sometimes we can find ourselves in a problematic framework for how to do this in a healthy way, and we can promote what I almost call the library savior complex mentality, which kind of creates a paternalistic relationship to underserved communities. So seeing communities as needing to be saved versus seeing them as powerful agents capable of designing their own solutions to the problems that they are facing. So it's sort of looking at communities from an asset-based model versus a deficit-based model. And I put the definition of anti-racism in here just because I would like to see the conversation in libraries really shift from just talking about diversity to actually taking an intentional stance around what it means to create anti-racist policies, practices, and culture.